The village cast Margaret Holloway out 4 days before Christmas. At 68 years old, she never imagined she would become homeless, especially not in winter, especially not after living in the valley her entire life. Yet there she stood beneath falling snow, clutching a lantern while her old sheepdog waited patiently beside a wagon containing everything she still owned. The dog's name was Duke, 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, slower than he used to be, but loyal beyond measure. If Margaret stopped, Duke stopped. If she walked, Duke walked. And on that bitter December morning, he was the only friend who remained. The trouble started months earlier. A wealthy mining company purchased large sections of land throughout the valley. Most people welcomed them. The company promised jobs, roads, prosperity, progress. Margaret saw something different. She saw contracts, property transfers, families pressured into selling, promises that sounded suspiciously familiar. She spoke openly about it. Too openly. People grew tired of hearing her warnings. Then the company announced plans to buy the community pasture. The same pasture local families had shared for generations. Margaret opposed it immediately, publicly, loudly. Unfortunately, most people wanted the money. Arguments followed, then resentment, then isolation. By December, nearly everyone considered her a troublemaker. The final confrontation happened during a town meeting. Margaret stood before the council and accused company representatives of misleading residents. The room exploded with shouting. Nobody wanted to hear it, especially not after signing contracts. When the meeting ended, the message became clear. Leave. Maybe not officially, maybe not legally, but undeniably. So she did. The first day alone felt manageable. The second felt frightening. The third felt impossible. Snow deepened steadily. Temperatures plummeted. The mountains disappeared behind storm clouds. Winter was gathering strength. Margaret knew she needed shelter. Permanent shelter. Not a tent. Not an overhang. Something capable of surviving a serious storm. The problem was finding it. Most abandoned cabins had already collapsed. Others stood too exposed. The mountains offered countless ways to freeze. Very few ways to survive. On the afternoon of the fourth day, Duke changed everything. The dog subtly left the trail. At first Margaret ignored him. Duke often wandered short distances before returning. This time he didn't return. Instead, barking echoed from somewhere ahead. Margaret frowned. Duke, another bark. Excited. Urgent. The old dog almost never sounded excited anymore. Curious, she followed. The terrain grew rough. Snow covered loose rocks. Dense brush blocked portions of the slope. Eventually, she reached a narrow ravine hidden between ridges. Then she saw Duke. The dog stood beside a mound of snow-covered earth. Barking furiously, Margaret approached slowly. What did you find? Duke scratched at the snow. She looked closer. At first she saw nothing. Then something caught her eye. Wood. A weathered timber protruding from the hillside. That didn't belong there. Margaret knelt, brushed away snow. More timber appeared. Then a doorway. Her pulse quickened. A doorway built directly into the hillside. Almost completely buried. Duke. The dog wagged his tail, apparently very proud of himself. Together they cleared additional snow. The structure gradually emerged. An old mine entrance. Abandoned. Forgotten. Hidden beneath decades of weather. Most people would have walked past without noticing. Margaret almost had. The doorway remained partially intact. Heavy support beams framed the entrance. Darkness waited beyond. She lifted her lantern, then stepped carefully inside. The tunnel extended straight into the mountain. Dry, stable, surprisingly well preserved. Old mining tracks still ran along portions of the floor. The deeper she walked, the more curious she became. Because something felt wrong. Or rather, too right. Abandoned mines usually collapsed, flooded, deteriorated. This one looked maintained. Not recently, but intentionally. After 50 feet, the tunnel widened. Then widened again. Margaret stopped. Her lantern illuminated something extraordinary. Shelves. Hundreds of shelves. Built directly into the rock walls. Every side chamber contained them. Every corridor contained more. Wooden shelving stretching into the darkness. Many stood empty. Some didn't. Her heart began racing. She stepped closer. Jars. Tools. Blankets. Candles. Cooking supplies. Not new, but preserved. Stored carefully. Protected from weather. Someone had stocked this place. Someone had planned. The discovery felt impossible. Margaret moved deeper. The mine transformed gradually. Work areas appeared. Storage rooms. Sleeping quarters. A kitchen. Not luxurious. Practical. Purposeful. The place resembled an underground survival refuge. Duke trotted happily through the corridors as if he owned them. Meanwhile, Margaret stared in disbelief. Because this wasn't merely shelter. This was a home. A hidden home. One prepared long ago by someone who understood winter. Then she found the journal. It rested atop a wooden desk in a side room. Dust covered everything. Yet the leather binding remained intact. Carefully she opened it. The first page contained a name. Thomas Granger, former mine foreman. The earliest entry dated nearly 40 years earlier. Margaret settled into a chair and began reading. According to the journal, the mine closed after production declined. Most workers left. Thomas stayed. He believed the tunnels offered unique advantages. Stable temperatures. Protection from storms. Storage space. Over time, he converted portions of the mine into a refuge. A place capable of supporting people through severe winters. The farther Margaret read, the more fascinating the story became. Thomas spent years improving the tunnels, adding shelves, stockpiling supplies, creating hidden rooms, preparing for disasters nobody else believed would happen. Then she reached the final section and froze, because Thomas repeatedly mentioned something deeper inside the mine. A second level, a section sealed behind an old cave-in. According to his notes, the lower chambers contained far more supplies than the upper refuge, enough to support dozens of people. Yet he never reopened the passage. The work proved too dangerous. The journal ended shortly afterward. Margaret slowly lowered the book. Outside, snow hammered the mountains. The storm she feared was finally arriving. Inside, she had already found shelter. But somewhere beyond the hidden tunnels and stocked shelves lay an even larger secret. And before winter ended, she suspected she would need it. The storm arrived that night. Not gradually, not politely. It slammed into the mountains with the force of a freight train. Wind screamed across the ridges. Snow poured from the sky. Temperatures collapsed. Within hours, every trail Margaret had followed disappeared beneath drifts. Yet inside the mine, silence remained. The difference felt surreal. 100 feet of solid mountain stood between her and the storm. The tunnels barely noticed winter. Margaret sat beside a small stove she found in one of Thomas Granger's workshops. Duke slept nearby. The old dog looked more comfortable than he had in weeks. For the first time since leaving the village, Margaret felt safe. The mine worked exactly as Thomas intended. Stable temperatures, dry storage, protection from weather, everything. 3 days passed. Then 4. The storm refused to end. Each morning Margaret explored new sections of the refuge. Each evening she returned with another discovery. More shelves, more supplies, more evidence that Thomas Granger had spent years preparing this place. The man hadn't built a shelter. He built a survival system. Then she found the map. The folded paper rested inside the final pages of Thomas's journal. Margaret almost missed it. Carefully unfolding it, she studied the faded markings. Her pulse quickened immediately. The map showed the upper refuge, the storage rooms, the workshops, but it also showed something else. The lower level, the sealed section Thomas repeatedly mentioned. A note written beside the passage caught her attention. Emergency stores. Open only if necessary. Margaret stared at the words. Outside, the blizzard continued worsening. Necessary suddenly seemed like a flexible definition. The next morning she followed the map. The route led through several abandoned mining corridors. Eventually, she reached the cave-in. Thomas described it accurately. Rock and debris blocked most of the tunnel. Yet not all of it. A narrow gap remained along one side. Small, dangerous, but passable. Margaret studied it carefully, then grabbed a lantern. Duke, stay close. The dog immediately followed. Slowly they squeezed through. The opening scraped her shoulders. Loose stones shifted beneath her boots. For several uncomfortable minutes, she wondered whether Thomas had been right to leave it alone. Then the passage opened, and Margaret stopped completely, because the chamber beyond looked enormous. Rows of shelves stretched into darkness. Not dozens, hundreds. The room resembled an underground warehouse. Crates filled entire sections. Barrels lined the walls. Tools hung from racks. Blankets, medical supplies, seeds, candles, cooking equipment. Everything organized carefully. Everything preserved. Everything waiting. Thomas Granger hadn't prepared for one bad winter. He prepared for disaster. Margaret slowly walked through the chamber, astonishment growing with every step. Then she discovered something even more surprising. Additional sleeping quarters. Large sleeping quarters. Enough space for dozens of people. Maybe more. The realization struck her immediately. Thomas expected others eventually. This place was never meant for one person. It was designed to save a community. The discovery stayed in her thoughts throughout the afternoon. Because outside, a community was currently facing the worst storm in decades. And many of those people were the same villagers who forced her out. The irony wasn't lost on her. That night the wind somehow grew louder. Even deep underground, she could hear it faintly. The mountain itself seemed to vibrate. Winter wasn't finished. Not even close. Then came the knocking. At first Margaret thought she imagined it. The sound felt impossible. No one could travel through conditions like these. Then it came again. A distant pounding echoing through the entrance tunnel. Duke lifted his head immediately. His ears perked. The dog heard it too. Margaret grabbed her lantern and hurried toward the entrance. The knocking continued. Weak. Desperate. She moved faster. Eventually, she reached the outer tunnel. Snow blocked most of the doorway. Digging through it took nearly half an hour. When she finally opened a gap, the sight beyond made her freeze. People. A long line of people. Families. Children. Elderly couples. Farmers. Villagers. The same villagers who called her a troublemaker. The same villagers who told her to leave. Leading them stood Mayor Collins. His face looked exhausted. His beard was coated with ice. For a moment neither spoke. The wind howled outside. Snow raced through the darkness. Then the mayor lowered his eyes. We need help. Margaret looked beyond him. At the children. At the frightened faces. At the elderly people barely standing. The storm had beaten them. Exactly as Thomas Granger feared decades earlier. Exactly as Margaret predicted weeks earlier. Without hesitation she stepped aside. Come in. Relief spread through the crowd instantly. One by one they entered the mine. And one by one they stopped. Because nobody expected what waited inside. Warmth. Light. Shelves filled with supplies. Storage rooms. Workshops. Safety. The deeper Margaret guided them into the refuge, the more shocked they became. Then she showed them the lower level. The emergency stores. The sleeping quarters. The enormous underground chambers. Children stared in amazement. Adults stood speechless. One farmer finally whispered, "This place is incredible." Margaret smiled. Thank Thomas Granger. For nearly 3 weeks the mine sheltered the village. The blizzard became legendary. Barns collapsed. Roads vanished. Several homes suffered severe damage. Yet inside the mountain, people survived. Food from Thomas's stores helped enormously. The sleeping quarters housed everyone comfortably. The old foreman's forgotten refuge performed exactly as intended. One evening Mayor Collins sat beside Margaret in the lower chamber. The old man stared at the shelves surrounding them, then sighed. We were wrong. Margaret looked at him. About what? The mayor laughed softly. Everything. He glanced around the refuge, then toward the families sleeping safely nearby. We called you a troublemaker. You did. We should have listened. Margaret nodded. Probably. The mayor smiled despite himself, then looked toward Duke sleeping beside the stove. You know, that dog might have saved every person here. Margaret laughed. He'd certainly believe that. Spring finally arrived. Snow melted. Trails reopened. Life slowly returned to the valley. But nothing returned exactly the way it was before. People remembered. The storm. The refuge. Thomas Granger. The old woman they ignored. Months later, Margaret stood outside the mine entrance watching sunlight touch the mountains. Duke sat beside her. The same dog who found the hidden doorway beneath the snow. The same dog who changed everything. Being cast out before Christmas had felt like losing her home. Instead, it led her to another one. A better one. A place built by a man who understood that survival belonged to those who prepared before disaster arrived. As the valley rebuilt below, one thing became certain. Nobody laughed at Margaret Holloway anymore. And nobody ever underestimated Duke again.